August 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The war in the Pacific was drawing to a close, but the tension on the ground hadn't evaporated. Japanese prisoners of war, captured months or years earlier in the jungles of New Guinea, the beaches of Saipan, the wreckage of Leyte, had been shipped across the ocean and across a continent to this strange land of green fields, red barns, and fat, smiling guards. They weren't tortured, they weren't starved. They were fed 3 times a day. But something about that calmness made some of them more nervous than combat had. From the barbed wire of Compound 6, the prisoners could see rows of American aircraft from the nearby National Guard airfield. Twin-engine C-47 Skytrains, parked in formation. Dozens, polished, powerful. A few B-25s sometimes came screaming overhead on training runs, and the men below would duck from habit, even though the machine guns had long fallen silent. This morning, though, there was something different in the air, literally. The smell of hot oil and gasoline had drifted in unusually thick through the pines. A low, rhythmic hum pulsed like a heartbeat in the ground. It was too steady to be a truck, too long to be distant thunder. Sergeant First Class Raymond Red Dalton leaned on the fence, chewing a toothpick. He tapped his boot on the dirt like a metronome. "They got no clue," he muttered to the guard next to him. Inside the barracks, a small group of Japanese prisoners had been called out by name, names they hadn't heard spoken aloud in months. Their barrack mates fell silent. When Lieutenant O'Malley from the U.S. Army Air Forces stepped inside the compound with a clipboard and a smile, even the wind stopped. 10 names, selected, all pilots. Former pilots. Flight Officer Akiro Sato, who had once flown Kai Oscars over the Philippines. Warrant Officer Masuda, who had crash-landed his Zero into a rice paddy outside Biak and been captured 3 days later. Corporal Nakamura, only 20 years old, had never even flown in combat. His first training mission had ended with a crash and surrender. He hadn't spoken since. As they were escorted out, the others stared in silence. Some thought they were being taken to be executed. Others feared they'd be interrogated by the Americans' own pilots, but none expected what was coming. The group was loaded into a deuce-and-a-half Army truck, canvas top peeled back. The guards didn't say much. Sergeant Dalton rode in back with them, sitting on a crate of Coca-Cola bottles, the ice long since melted. He tossed one to Masuda with a lazy flick. Masuda caught it, stared at the glass bottle, then at Dalton. "For me?" he asked in broken English. Dalton grinned. "Ain't gonna drink itself." Masuda squinted, unscrewed the cap, took one cautious sip and froze. "This is cold." He didn't mean temperature. When the truck stopped, it was on a tarmac baking under the sun. 3 olive-drab C-47s sat with their engines idling, props thumping the air into a pulsing blur. Each had its cargo ramp lowered like a giant mouth yawning. Sato's jaw tightened. "Why are we here?" he asked. O'Malley walked up, eyes shielded by aviator glasses. He handed each man a leather flight helmet and goggles. "You boys said you used to fly, right?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Well, we figured you'd want to know what freedom smells like up here." Masuda looked confused. Nakamura looked terrified. "We are going into those." "Yup," Dalton said, slapping the side of the nearest plane. "Flying's not just for killing, you know. Sometimes it's just to see." They were herded up the ramps, past crates of empty cargo nets into the long, bare fuselage. No guns, no bombs, just benches along the side and the smell of rubber and grease and sky. When the engines roared to full power, Nakamura clutched his seat with white knuckles. Sato's heart pounded, not with fear but something stranger. Memory, longing. The wheels rumbled, the nose lifted, and gravity fell away. None of them spoke. For nearly 30 seconds they were all boys again, 15 years old, dreaming of touching the sky. Then the plane banked hard left and Wisconsin spread out beneath them like a toy map. Fields, silos, roads, all quiet. Dalton, riding in the opposite bench, pulled a Hershey bar from his vest and passed it over. "Don't bite too fast," he said. or you'll cry twice. Sato didn't understand the joke, but he bit, and when the sugar hit his tongue, he did cry. The American pilot called out from the cockpit, voice echoing through the intercom. "We're gonna take her over the lake, boys. Hope nobody's scared of water." Masuda laughed, actually laughed. It startled even him. For the next 20 minutes, those 10 men saw America not from behind wire or gun barrels, but from the air. Vast, green, endless. No trenches, no bomb craters, just freedom, just horizon. When they landed, none of them moved at first. Sato stepped off the plane last. He touched the edge of the cargo ramp like a shrine. "Why?" he asked. Dalton looked at him. "Because you were soldiers, now you're just men. Men get to fly." Nakamura sat down on the grass and wept. The others didn't stop him. They were driven back in silence, still clutching the flight helmets like relics. No one in the compound asked what had happened. They didn't have to. The look on their faces said everything. Something had cracked open. And back in the airfield, O'Malley made a note in his logbook. 10 Japanese POWs, first flight in U.S. aircraft. Reaction, human. The following morning, the air around Compound 6 buzzed, not with engines but with rumors. Word had already traveled faster than any truck. The 10 men had returned changed. No bruises, no blood, but visibly altered. A few offered nods to fellow prisoners they hadn't spoken to in months. One man, Sergeant Akabe, who'd once broken another prisoner's nose for smiling at an American, was now helping clean the latrine without being asked. Another had folded his blanket so sharply, it looked like a military inspection drill. Sato barely spoke. He sat near the barracks entrance, tracing the outline of the leather flight helmet he'd been allowed to keep. Occasionally he looked up at the sky, not with longing but confusion. Something wasn't adding up. It was Nakamura who finally broke the silence that evening. He'd been a ghost in the camp for months, never speaking, never volunteering, staring at the walls during roll call like he was waiting to wake up from a dream. But as the sun set behind the pines and the sky turned the color of burnt brass, he stood beside the communal table and whispered, "They weren't trying to humiliate us." No one replied. "They weren't mocking us," he added louder this time. "They gave us something." Lieutenant Takashi Endo, a captured engineer from Manchuria, narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying?" "They let us fly," Nakamura said. "Just to fly, nothing else." "That's a trick," muttered another. "Propaganda, they want us to break." "I already was," Nakamura said softly. "But I wasn't on that flight, not really. I was 15 again, before the war, in the grass fields outside Kumamoto, before everything went dark." The barrack fell silent. Even the guards outside seemed to pause, cigarettes burning quietly in the dusk. The next day, 2 more names were read off a new clipboard. Then 3 more. Then 5. Each time a small group was selected. No one resisted. No one objected. Each returned the same quiet, shaken, reverent. It wasn't long before a new problem emerged: jealousy. Men who had never flown in Japan's Imperial Army or Navy, infantrymen, cooks, mechanics, now wanted to go. Rumors spread that the flights were a reward, a form of psychological bribery. Others said it was the Americans testing their reactions, measuring who could be turned. Then something unexpected happened. On the 5th day, one of the men who'd returned from the flight, Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, a former rear gunner in a G-4M Betty bomber, requested to speak with an American officer. It wasn't an interrogation. It wasn't about repatriation. He wanted to write a letter. To his mother. "I need to tell her," he said, staring at the floor in the guard office, "that I saw the sky again." Captain Rourke, a quiet Air Corps officer with a faded patch on his shoulder, looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "We'll get you paper." The letter never made it out of the camp. Censorship regulations blocked it. But the act of writing it changed something. Rourke brought the letter back to his bunk that night, read the translation twice, then sat on his cot, staring at a small photograph of his own mother taped to the footlocker. "These boys aren't what we were told," he murmured. 2 days later, Rourke made a call to Fort Snelling. A proposal, something bigger, something coordinated. "Give me 30, he said. 30 of them. Let's fill the whole bird, take 'em higher. Give 'em a view they'll never forget." "You're out of your mind," the major on the other end replied. "Yeah, and they've been out of theirs since we dropped bombs on their home islands. Let's give them something else to remember us by." After 3 days of clearance, background checks, and frantic paperwork, the order came down. Approved. One full C-47 flight of Japanese POWs. 30 men. The selection was delicate. Too many officers and it'd look political. Too many young ones and it'd look like a stunt. So they mixed them. Aviators, foot soldiers, cooks, medics, one even an artist who'd been captured in the Philippines sketching topography. August 23rd. The morning air was sharp and clear, with long shadows stretching across the tarmac. The C-47 had been freshly scrubbed, its silver belly gleaming under the sun. Painted on the nose in chalk were 4 big words written in both English and phonetic katakana. No guns, no war, just sky. When the prisoners were marched onto the field, there was no mockery. The guards didn't grin. The pilots didn't boast. There was a mutual understanding now. A kind of sacred space had been created. As they loaded in, Nakamura froze at the ramp, gripping the edge. Sergeant Dalton placed a hand on his back. "You came back last time," he said. "This time take something with you." "What?" Dalton nodded toward the sky. "Peace, if you can find it." Inside, the aircraft was nearly full. The benches creaked with weight and tension. Some of the prisoners whispered. Others stared at the floor. A few looked out the round porthole windows, already dreaming. The engines roared. The tires screamed against the tarmac. And then the plane leapt. Below them, Wisconsin turned into a tapestry. The forests became brushstrokes. Lakes mirrored the clouds. Silos like chess pieces. Roads like thread. 15 minutes in, the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit with a metal thermos and handed it to one of the guards. Inside, fresh black coffee and strips of bacon wrapped in wax paper. One by one, the men were handed pieces. Hot, salty, unfamiliar. For many, it was their first taste of American food beyond the rations. Tanaka whispered, "We thought they fed us this way to dull us, but this," he bit into the bacon, closed his eyes, "this is like being forgiven." 2 hours in, the C-47 reached its cruising altitude and gently banked over Lake Michigan. The water below was endless, blue-gray and glittering. They weren't flying over a city. They weren't flying over war. Just nature, just the curve of the earth. One man, Private Kenta Hashino, began to weep, not from fear but from memory. He whispered to no one in particular, "When I was 5, I used to fly paper kites with my brother. They looked like this lake, endless, beautiful." The American pilot over the intercom asked in slow English, "How's the ride back there?" No answer. Just silence. And then a single clap. And another. Until 30 Japanese prisoners of war, some captured in brutal fighting, some nearly starved before capture, some once sworn to fight to the death, applauded an American aircraft circling peacefully over farmland. When they landed, they didn't move right away. The silence was complete. One by one, they exited the plane. No one ran, no one bowed. They just stepped down as if walking out of a temple. Captain Rourke met them with a clipboard. "Did anyone get sick?" he asked. No one answered. But Nakamura stepped forward, raised his hand, and in halting English said, "Please, may I go again someday?" Rourke's mouth curled into a smile. "We'll see." That night the entire barrack changed. Men wrote letters, some cried, some laughed. Others lay awake staring at the roof, not thinking of war, thinking of clouds, thinking of peace. From that day forward, the American guards at Camp McCoy no longer carried their rifles within sight of Compound 6. Orders were orders, yes, but somehow they all knew something had shifted. And it had all begun the moment a group of enemies looked out a window and saw not targets but trees. 3 days after the 30-man flight, the American camp commandant, Colonel Joseph Barringer, received a handwritten letter delivered by one of the MPs, not from a general or a politician or even a fellow officer. It was from Corporal Masuda. Written carefully in perfect kanji on army-issue lined paper, it bore no protest, no demand, just a simple plea: let me help others see what I saw. Masuda wanted to speak to the camp's other Japanese prisoners, not about surrender, not about betrayal, but about flying, about the sensation of lifting off, about how, for a few moments in the sky, he hadn't felt like a prisoner. He hadn't even felt Japanese or enemy or soldier. He just felt human again. Barringer, who had been a combat officer in France in 1918, stared at the letter for a long time before setting it on his desk, smoothing the creases with a trembling hand. "Damned if we didn't win more in the clouds than we ever did in the mud," he muttered. He gave the order. Masuda could speak. But not with guards around, not under watch. He would be allowed to speak freely. The meeting was held in the compound mess hall, a converted wooden barn with no insulation and a squeaky ceiling fan that never worked. 80 folding chairs were dragged in by volunteers. It wasn't mandatory to attend, but by the time the first words were spoken, over 140 prisoners were packed inside, men standing shoulder to shoulder, silent, sweating, unsure what to expect. Masuda stepped up to a crude plywood platform. No microphone, no guards inside. He bowed, then raised his head. "I once flew a Zero," he said in Japanese. "I believed it made me invincible. Then I was shot down, broke both my legs, and was captured by Americans with hands gentler than my own Captain S." He let the words sit. "I have hated every day since. Hated the defeat, the shame, the humiliation. But then they took me up in the sky." He described the noise, the smell, the shock of freedom, how every instinct had screamed that it was a trick, a trap, but how none of those fears came true. "They let me sit there. No chains, no interrogation. They gave me a chocolate bar and let me see the horizon again, and it broke me." He looked down at his feet, then slowly back up. "I was not broken by war. I was broken by kindness." A ripple moved through the crowd like wind through grass. "I don't know what this country is. I don't know what its government does. But I know what it feels like to be treated as a man again, and I want that for all of you." He stepped back. No applause, no questions, just silence. That night, 4 men confessed to camp officials that they had been planning an escape. 2 had hidden tools. Another had carved a replica key from soup bones. All 4 handed over their contraband willingly. "I still want to go home," one of them said, "but I no longer want to run." Colonel Barringer lit his pipe and said nothing, just nodded. After that night, the airlift requests flooded in. The War Department hadn't planned for any of this. It had been meant as a curiosity, a minor act of morale and human decency. Now they were receiving letters from other POW camps across the Midwest. Camp Atterbury in Indiana, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, even Camp Huntsville in Texas. Each letter was the same: "We've heard what you're doing in McCoy. Can we do the same?" It wasn't about winning hearts. It wasn't about propaganda. It was something deeper, something wordless. But the military bureaucracy didn't move without friction. "You want to put enemy combatants in our aircraft," growled Major General Langdon at a meeting in Chicago. "Are you insane?" Colonel Barringer had been flown in to explain himself. Langdon slammed the folder shut. "If this is some kind of liberal sympathy stunt, You'll have your stars stripped so fast." Barringer didn't flinch. He pulled a yellowed envelope from his breast pocket and set it on the table. Langdon hesitated. Inside was a photograph, grainy black and white, taken by a camp medic who'd been invited along on one of the flights. It showed 6 Japanese prisoners, seated at the rear of the C-47, gazing out a side window as the sun spilled through the clouds like liquid gold. None were smiling. None were crying. Just watching, faces slack with awe. Behind them, an American airman held a thermos in one hand and a tin cup in the other, offering them coffee. Langdon stared at it a long time. "Why'd you bring this?" he asked. Barringer stood straight. "Because I don't care about policy, sir. I care about what works." Langdon exhaled. "And you think this is going to make them, what, friendlier?" "No," Barringer said, "but it might make them human again. And that's a better start than anything we've done since they got here." Langdon sat back. "Fine," he said, "but you keep it quiet. No newspapers, no reporters. If word gets out the army's flying enemy prisoners around like tourists, we'll have Congress breathing down our necks." Barringer nodded. "We'll keep the sky to ourselves." Back at Camp McCoy, preparations were already underway for something more ambitious. Rourke and Dalton were now full-time coordinators, organizing not just flights but pre-briefings in both English and Japanese. They built wooden mock-ups of the aircraft interior so prisoners would know what to expect. They trained interpreters to explain turbulence, altitude sickness, even the strange yawing sensation during turns. They called it the Horizon Program. It wasn't official, but the name stuck. Flight Officer Ikiro Sato, once so withdrawn, now spent his days sketching diagrams of American aircraft for other prisoners, explaining flaps, engines, controls. His tone had changed. No longer bitter, just curious. "Why do they give this to us?" a younger man asked. Sato shrugged. "Maybe they think we'll talk. Maybe they think we'll tell our families. Maybe they don't care." "But aren't we the enemy?" Sato paused, then said, "Up there I couldn't tell." The following week, a new kind of flight was proposed, one with a civilian passenger. His name was Kenji Aso, 71 years old, captured on the island of Guam while digging latrines for the Imperial Army. Not a soldier, not even a proper laborer, just a poor man trying to survive, conscripted in the final days. Aso had never been more than 20 feet off the ground in his life. When asked if he wanted to join, he hesitated. "I am old," he said, "and I am not useful." "You're human," Dalton replied. "That's enough." When the plane took off, Aso trembled, not from fear, from disbelief. He held the side rail with both hands as the world dropped away beneath them. As the fields fell into pattern and the sky opened above, he whispered a single word over and over. "Atsukashii." Beautiful. When they landed, he had to be helped off the ramp, but his eyes were alive. On the way back to the compound, he sang, not loudly, just a quiet childhood tune no one else recognized. It was the first song sung in Compound 6. More flights followed. The barracks that had once been heavy with silence now hummed with questions. What did the plane feel like? What did it smell like? Was it hot? Did you see water? One by one they answered. And behind the wire, the impossible began to happen. Men who had sworn to never speak to their captors now nodded to guards. One prisoner, an angry former artillery captain named Koizumi, offered to help repair the broken generator that powered the camp's mess hall. When asked why, he said, "Because I want the coffee machine working next time I land." Dalton laughed so hard he choked. Even the American guards were changing. They began rotating volunteers for the flights. Some took Polaroids, others kept journals. One entry read simply, "Today I flew with men I used to fear. They're just men." And in the middle of it all was Nakamura, once silent, now a kind of folk hero. He didn't speak much still, but every time a new group was selected, he was the one who stood at the fence, hand on the shoulder of the next man, whispering, "Don't be afraid, the sky is not a lie." It wasn't about flying anymore. It was about becoming something else. Not enemy, not prisoner, just human. And the Americans, officers, enlisted, aircrew, realized something unspoken. The war had ended up there, somewhere in the clouds, where hatred couldn't follow. By early September, the cold had begun to crawl back into Wisconsin. The maple trees bordering Camp McCoy were dusting red, and every gust of wind rattled dry leaves like spent shell casings. It had been nearly a month since the first flight, and by now, over 120 Japanese prisoners had been airborne. But that was not what made the camp strange. It was the sound. Not boots, not shouting, not silence. Laughter. From inside Compound 6, the unmistakable sound of men laughing drifted through the wire. A rhythmic, unguarded kind of laughter, sometimes sharp, sometimes breathless, sometimes interrupted by someone shouting "Baka" at a bunkmate, but laughter all the same. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't the manic cackling of men losing their grip. It was joy, a kind most of the guards hadn't heard since before Guadalcanal. Even the dogs noticed. Sergeant Dalton, leaning against the tower fence with a mug of bitter coffee, glanced at the patrol shepherd sitting by his feet. "We're getting soft, Rusty," he muttered. The dog yawned and looked bored. But the truth was, something else had begun shifting, something harder to explain than morale. Art. On a Tuesday morning, Private Hashino approached the gate holding a roll of paper under his arm. He handed it to the MP without a word. The guard unrolled it. It was a sketch of the C-47 banking over Pine Forest, detailed, beautiful, shadowed, as if drawn from inside the plane during that silent moment when the earth fell away and everything felt clean. Captain Rourke saw it and asked, "He drew this from memory?" The MP shrugged, "Guess so." 3 more appeared the next week, then 5, then 30, portraits, engines, wings, clouds. Some even depicted American pilots with kind eyes handing out coffee or chewing gum. Rourke began pinning them up in the briefing room. Then, at someone's suggestion, he started sending copies to Fort Snelling. 2 weeks later, a telegram arrived from Washington. Request approved, exhibit of POW artwork authorized, limited release, internal display only. And just like that, what had begun as flights of mercy became a cultural shift. A makeshift gallery was arranged in a repurposed storage shed just outside the wire. 50 drawings, all anonymous, every one of them done by a man who had once sworn to die before capture. The title on the hand-painted sign above the door was simple: "Through Their Eyes." The guards came first, then the pilots, then the officers. Some laughed at the caricatures, others wept at the realism, a few couldn't speak. One sketch showed a group of Japanese POWs staring out the side window of the aircraft, their reflections faint in the curved glass, and behind them, an American pilot reaching up to adjust a dial, his face unreadable. The caption written in pencil at the bottom was in English. "He did not look at me with hate." The exhibit stayed open every day from 900 to 1700. By the 3rd week, even locals from the nearby town of Sparta had begun requesting access. Teachers, veterans, ministers. Winter came early that year. By late September, Camp McCoy's fields had already crusted with frost. The maple trees that had glowed red just weeks earlier now stood naked and gray against the sky. The wind had a bite to it, even at noon, and the guards wore scarves over their collars. The war was officially over. Surrender documents signed. Emperor's voice played over scratchy radios, broadcast across the world. But inside Compound 6, the war had ended weeks earlier. Somewhere between the pine tree line and the clouds, it had slipped away, like breath on a window pane. And now came the question no one had asked yet: what happens next? Most Japanese POWs would soon begin the process of repatriation. Transports were being prepared, ships assembled. A few had already gone, those too ill to work or too broken to wait. But the vast majority, over 400 men at Camp McCoy alone, still stood behind barbed wire waiting. Waiting for home. But what was home now? Every one of them had a different idea of what they would return to. Some feared shame, others feared rubble, some feared nothing at all because they had nothing left to fear. And still, they gathered near the fence line every morning, looking at the same sky that had once lifted them into silence. One morning, Colonel Barringer stood outside the main gate, watching the POWs begin their daily work detail. He noted the way they walked straighter now, not stiff, not defiant, just men, not numbers, not soldiers, just men again. Sergeant Dalton stood beside him, coat collar flipped up, fingers curled around a canteen of hot tea. "They used to look at us like animals," Dalton said. "Now they nod." Barringer didn't respond right away. "Then we didn't give them much, a seat, a sky, some coffee." Dalton glanced sideways. "Sometimes it doesn't take much." Inside the barracks, Nakamura sat by the wood stove, whittling a piece of scrap pine. He didn't speak. He rarely did, even now. But his hands had learned a new rhythm, slow, methodical, clean. Sato entered, carrying a folded paper tucked under one arm. "I got something," he said, laying the sheet down. The others gathered. It was a copy of a small newsletter printed by American camp staff, the McCoy Morning, normally filled with announcements, dates, even crossword puzzles. But on the last page in black ink was something different. A poem. No author listed, no credit, just words. They flew once, not to conquer, not to kill, but to remember that clouds do not ask for flags, and wind does not care for uniforms. They flew once, and in the sky, they found the part of themselves the war had taken. The room was silent. No one knew who had written it. Some said a pilot. Others thought maybe one of the prisoners. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it existed. Sato folded the paper again and placed it in a small tin with a photograph of his mother and a scrap of silk from his old flight scarf. He said nothing, just placed it in his footlocker and latched it shut. Repatriation orders came in waves. Men were assigned numbers, dates, routes. Most would be sent to Seattle, then by ship to Japan. The first names posted to the board drew a small crowd. Masuda, Iso, Hashino, Tanaka. Nakamura's name was not listed, not yet. But he didn't flinch, he just kept carving. The goodbyes were quiet. No handshakes, no dramatic speeches, just nods, looks. Sometimes a folded sketch passed from one man to another, or a bar of chocolate pocketed like a treasure. On October 12th, as the sun broke through morning frost, the first transport truck rolled to the edge of Compound 6. Masuda was among them. He carried nothing but a folded blanket and a tin of belongings. As he passed the guard tower, he paused. Dalton stood above, arms crossed, chewing a toothpick. Masuda looked up, held his gaze. Dalton nodded. Masuda nodded back. The truck rolled on. 3 days later, another transport, then another. By the end of the month, half the camp was gone. But before they left, every man was given a small envelope. Inside, a single photograph of the C-47 against a backdrop of sky. On the back, hand-stamped in red ink, it read, "Thank you for flying, you are not forgotten." No insignia, no rank, just those words. The guards didn't know who stamped them. Rumor said it was Captain Rourke. Another claimed it was Beringer himself. The truth didn't matter. The gesture did. On October 27th, the final transport prepared for departure. Sato stood at the gate, duffel slung over one shoulder. The frost had turned to sleet, and the guards wore full parkas now. Across the field, the last C-47 used in the Horizon program sat under canvas wraps, her engines long cold. Sato asked for a moment. Just one. No one stopped him. He walked across the field through soft snow and placed a hand on the engine cowling. Not long, just enough. Then he whispered, "I remembered who I was up there." He turned and left. Back in the now half-empty compound, Nakamura sat by the stove, still carving. He'd been told his name was on the next list, November. But he didn't rush. He carved slow. That night, as sleet tapped the tin roof, the barracks dim and half-filled, he finished. The carving was a pair of wings. Not military, not modeled after any plane. Just wings, arch-strong, unbroken. He laid them on the windowsill and sat back. No words. None needed. And when the final truck pulled away weeks later, the guards stood outside in silence. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Some saluted. Some simply watched. In the emptying spaces of Compound 6, only the wind remained. And one small wooden pair of wings, resting on a windowsill, catching the last light of an autumn sun.